made a statement about the need for funding to be predictable and sustained. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And our superintendents, am I correct in understanding that you used one-time federal dollars for recurring expenses? Is that correct?
Well, with the pilot program that I discussed with and bringing back the 13 teachers that were furloughed, we created a memorandum of understanding with the teachers union, identifying that when the ESSER money runs out, which would be the upcoming school year, that we would no longer employ those teachers. So they were only utilized because of the fact that we had such overcrowding in our elementary buildings, over 30 per class, that if we could utilize those teachers for a very small amount of time, that we would most certainly help lower those class sizes, which we did. But once the ESSER funding runs out, there is a memorandum of understanding that those teachers will no longer be employed.
I believe, Dr. McAndrews, you also testified that you used one-time federal dollars for recurring expenses at Panther Valley. Is that correct?
I'll give you an example. Prior to COVID and prior to this one-time funding, we had very few computers in our district. Well, then we had to go one-to-one, as COVID hit. Our computers now are coming up on a 4-year cycle, and now we don't have that money again to buy new computers to keep things updated. We also had, during that one-time money, we went out and bought things like math programs to go along with the computers, and those are 3-year licenses. So all those one-time money is now coming to an end, and now we have a huge burden again for a need.
Right. So if we follow that example of what you have done, right? Because the rainy day fund, that budget surplus that the Commonwealth has, is the result of a massive amount of federal dollars coming into the Commonwealth. In less than 2 years, our rainy day fund would be depleted and spent on recurring expenses if we use those dollars to fund the request. We would be making the exact same mistake, again, of taking one-time federal revenue and using it on recurring expenses. So I am concerned about, making a blank statement that we've not talked about raising taxes, right? Because if we use one-time federal dollars for recurring expenses and you come back to us and say, you gave us that money last year and we need it, and we have a depleted rainy day fund, which, by the way, having those dollars in the rainy day fund have done two really important things. One, with inflation being at an all-time high, thanks to federal policies, the interest rate that we are earning on those dollars in that savings account is creating additional revenue for us, right? And so we are going to lose that safety net in the future, and we would not be generating that extra revenue, right? So that's obviously a concern. The other concern that I have is that we received testimony from a gentleman who has been quoted extensively in both Ms. McInerney and, I am so sorry, Mr. Urovic Acklesberg.
That's actually right, and
is that good?
It's happened
All right.
before, I assure you.
Okay, I'm so sure. I have a hyphenated last name as well. It's tough. They call me by my initials. It makes it a lot easier. But my concern is that when he provided his testimony before the courts, he indicated that that adequacy shortfall in revenue would be $4.6 billion. Yesterday, his testimony changed and said it would be $6.2 billion. Today, Ms. McInerney testified, I want to make sure I get this right, that it was 20%, which would be about a $1.574 billion shortfall. So we have received very conflicting testimony from the same people, and much of your testimony, Dr. Urovic Acklesberg, was predicated on those numbers. So it leads me to ask you, what numbers were you using when you put together your testimony?
So first, my mother would be very proud if I were a doctor, but I am not.
Nor am I.
Yeah,
And we
first-
illustrated my PTSD from quantitative research methods in grad school yesterday. So yes.
So no, it's a great question, and I know that there's numbers being thrown around, and I'm happy to walk you through that. To start, my testimony was actually largely just quoting the court's opinion.
Which was predicated on the $4.6 billion number that he had provided to the court.
No, respectfully, it was the evidence, the entire mountain of evidence that was before the court about what school districts couldn't do, that the very resources that they were being deprived of as a result of this funding system. Dr. Kelly testified at trial that if you used the adequacy targets under section 2502.48 of the school code, it would have a $4.6 billion shortfall. Now, he noted that at the time, that is also has a base cost in it, just like his updated study did. But what he noted is that at the time, that included much lower, for example, spending on school share of mandated expenses, right? So if pensions have gone up since then, he said at the time, you can expect that this number actually would go higher, but I'm calculating what's in the current school code. I'm calculating what's in 2502.48 of the school code. And he said that also doesn't include special education, it doesn't include charter school reimbursements, and there's a slightly different weight in today's fair funding formula than was in the previous code. So he was upfront saying, this is based on, I'm using your data based on what's in the school code, and there was a debate as to whether that was current law or not. And he said, you run those numbers, and it's $4.6 billion. Yesterday, what he said is, if you use today's fair funding formula, not 2502.48, and you look at what's the typical school that's doing well in Pennsylvania, spending relative to its needs under the basic ed and special ed formula, similar process to level up effectively, looking at your total need, what are they spending according to those weights? And because the fair funding formula and the special ed formula, obviously.
Typically, what you are testifying to today is that he used a different calculation with different inputs in the court testimony than he did yesterday. So we need to, again, and I think the chairman indicated yesterday, we're going to try and quantify that. But I appreciate you making that point, which we are not comparing apples to oranges.
Right.
So I appreciate that.
I add
the
one
other
point
thing,
to that.
well, if I may, I have a couple of questions, and we are really trying, we struggled with time yesterday. We're trying to stay on time. So 2 more things. Local taxing reliance. Dr. Urovic Acklesberg, you noted many points, and I read through it last night, and I highlighted them with regard to our system being overly reliant on local taxpayers. Ms. McInerney, you also testified here today with regard to the fact that in your testimony you said the court directed the General Assembly to address the division of state and local funding to ensure it is equitable and does not overburden low wealth districts. I've heard it from both these superintendents today. They don't have a district or a community that is able to provide that share. So it really, to me, and we heard this yesterday as well, it begs the question. Everyone just continues to talk about putting more state dollars into this formula, but my question to you is this whole formula of the division between local and state share, is this something that needs to be addressed? Because you take the status quo and just say, pour more money into it, where I'm looking at this and saying, is there a structural problem with the entire system of taxation? And I believe the courts reference this, that it's not just a problem with the amount of money, it's how the money is collected and how that money is distributed. Have you given any thought to this entire structure?
Sure. So, and I think if you look at Dr. Kelly's report from yesterday, he says, I did not calculate state and local share. That is something that has to be decided. What the decision said is that low wealth communities just are stuck, right? So they have no way out of this box. So certainly a system, I mean, one task for the commission is to figure out how to make it feasible and reasonable in such a way that the lowest wealth communities can actually do the things which we instruct them to do and which they have which their kids have a constitutional right to. that should look at what is an equitable division here between state and local taxpayers that makes sense. But it has to make sense in a way that actually allows low wealth communities. I think Panther Valley is the 10th highest tax rate of 500 districts, something like that. It actually has to allow it to occur in those districts. In other words, you can't set adequacy targets and then walk away, because that's effectively what we've already done. Because superintendents in wealthier parts of the community, they have adequacy targets. They may not calculate them like that, but they start each year with the educational program that they need for their kids, and then their school boards fund them. But in low wealth communities, it's what are we going to cut this year? What are we going to scrimp on? Who are the few kids that we get those resources? So it absolutely has to be, state and local division absolutely has to be part of your discussion. Dr. Kelly's analysis, which I think Ms. McInerney described, was a 20% increase in total spending, not basic education. If you look at our current expenditures, $6 billion is about 20% of our total current expenditures in the Commonwealth, and said that there's going to have to be some way to figure out how to divide this up in a way that actually works for every.
And lastly, we have taken decades to get to this point in time, correct?
Unfortunately,
Right?
yes.
Okay. So yesterday in his testimony, Dr. Kelly indicated that implementation would take time. We are hearing different things. What do you envision in terms of a timeline for implementation?
So I can give you just one person's perspective, but I think that superintendents, they can tell you, have to plan. I mean, frankly, we need to hire up teachers. We need you all to go to our teaching colleges and say, like, Pennsylvania is open for business as the best place to be a teacher. We really have long work ahead of us. I think that it has to be urgent, like it has to both be reasonable but respectful of the urgency of the problem. And so I don't think anyone's expecting this to be solved in 1 year, but we also can't wait for 10 years, because in that time, a child who's in kindergarten will already be through high school. So I think there's a give and take here. When superintendents can plan, they can thoughtfully increase the programs, scale things up. You all can get to work opening pipelines. We can all get to work to make this happen. So it's not overnight, but it is urgent. I don't want to give you a magic number.
No,
but
I appreciate that. I think overnight would be an audacious
yes.
goal. So I thank you. Thank you very much for your testimony.